Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the special meeting of the Edina City Council on June 25th, 2013. And roll call, please. Ms. Mangan.
Member Bennett?
Here.
Member Sprague?
Here.
Member Swenson?
Here.
Mayor Hovland?
Here. And you've probably noticed that Member Brindle is absent. She will not be rushing in late. For the past year, she's been the president-elect of the Edina Morningside Rotary Club that I belong to, and as timing would have it, the incoming president goes to the International Rotary meeting, and she's in Lisbon, Portugal, so it would have been hard to have her here. That was a commitment made long ago, so that's why she is absent this evening. We've got a form of agenda. Are there any changes or additions to the agenda this evening?
Yes, Your Honor. I would like to add to the agenda a resolution in support of Timothy O'Brien as the Metropolitan Airport Commission member for District C.
All right, we'll add that in as Romans 6, right before adjournment. And
with that, I would move approval of the agenda.
all right.
And I will second.
All right, we've got a motion and a second on the modified agenda. Any further discussions? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed say nay. Thank you, Member Bennett. And now we have, well, nice to see a good group of our fellow citizens here, all concerned about the same thing. This began back in November last year when we got short notice on a MAC hearing, a MAC board hearing that was going to involve the potential changing of some flight patterns based on some new technology that was available to 2 tracks. And I think Scott Neal is going to make a little bit of a background presentation to further clarify what we're going to be doing this evening. And we have gone through the effort, I can tell you, of retaining aviation counsel, experienced aviation counsel. And they're going to make a presentation tonight as well. So I'll let Scott explain in more detail. Scott Neal.
Thank you, Your Honor. As you'll recall, and as you just recounted, we had an experience back in November of 2012 in which we had, for maybe not the first time, but maybe an early time anyway, for Edina to have an interaction with the Metropolitan Airports Commission around the issue of aviation noise. We were fortunate in that respect in November of 2012 that the MAC Commission agreed to essentially sideline a proposal that could have resulted in additional noise in Edina. The result of that sidelining was that it provided us an opportunity to become more informed on the issue and to prepare for really the very certain likelihood that we will face that issue once again in the future. In order to become more prepared, I had retained a gentleman by the name of Peter Kirsch from a law firm in Colorado. We're going to hear from him shortly. I had a previous experience with Mr. Kirsch in a previous job that went very well. He has previous experience in the Twin Cities, previous experience with MAC, and experience in this issue all over the country, and I'll let him tell you a little bit more about that. So for tonight, what we had in mind and what we have Mr. Kirsch is ready to do is really to provide you a briefing as the governing board of the city in a very public atmosphere. Normally in a private sector situation, this would be done behind a closed door where legal counsel gives you your options and explains maybe strategy and tactics. We don't have the ability to do that as a public body in Minnesota, so we have to do some of that kind of advising in an open public sphere, and that's what we're prepared to do tonight. I think, though, Mr. Kirsch is a good enough lawyer that he's probably not going to expose all of our potential tactics and strategies tonight, but really probably save some of those, and I'll let him speak for himself when it comes to that. But really the purpose of the night is for him to give you the introductory discussion and presentation about this issue, about aviation noise, about his own experience, and give you some sense of where he thinks we ought to position ourselves for the future when we do face this issue in just probably a year and a half from now. So the presentation we have for you tonight is for council. It's not designed as a public hearing, as was noted earlier. There'll probably certainly be opportunities for public input in the future, but in this setting, the presentation is designed primarily as a presentation to you with Q&A from council members.
All right, good.
Manager Neal, can I ask you a question? Will we then be putting this on Channel 16 at a later date because we're filming it tonight?
We are. We're live on Channel 16 right now, and we are recording this, and it will be up on our archive of our council meetings, just as every other council meeting is.
Okay.
So in other words, viewable on the website as well as cable channel 16
That's right.
for
Yep.
people who don't have cable or prefer
That's
to
correct.
watch in that way.
Right.
Thank you.
So for folks in the audience, while this was not noticed up as a public hearing, obviously a public meeting, and we're grateful that all of you chose to attend. And we should remind folks that if subsequent to the meeting you have questions that you want to pose to the council or you think are important for Mr. Kirsch to consider, feel free to write to the council about any issues that you have concern with following the meeting this evening, and then we'll take those up in due course. I can also tell you that I was in a meeting this afternoon of the greater MSP organization, which is our regional economic development entity. Happened to be sitting next to Jeff Hamill from the MAC, from the Metropolitan Airports Commission, and he did confirm for me that based on a prior request, it looks like we've got a 90% chance of having him here on the 16th of July, which will be our only city council meeting in July because of the 4th of July timing. So July 16th, you can mark your calendars accordingly if you want to come to the city council meeting, and Mr. Hamill will make a presentation on what he calls MAC 101, so we can get a good background on the operations of the MAC, which some of us have seen over at the legislature. So I think that'll be helpful to this whole process as well. Member
Mayor,
Clinton.
that won't be a public hearing either, but if there are any particular questions that come to mind that you would like us to ask Mr. Hamill, please send them to us ahead of time in the email form so we have the opportunity to try to field as many of your questions as we might have time for.
Thanks for that thought. It's a good one. All right. Mr. Kirsch, you want to welcome? Thanks for coming up from Denver.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. It's my pleasure to be here this evening to try to, if you will, cast a little light on the issue of flight tracks and as they may affect the city of Edina. I've got a presentation I'd like to walk through, but feel free to interrupt me. We'll try to keep this as informal, Mr. Mayor, as you find appropriate. And I will walk through what I hope will be basic enough that it's understandable, but not so basic as to be information that you all already know about flight tracks and how to understand them. Mr. Neal asked that I start out, let's see if I can get this working right. Well, we're going to do it the old-fashioned way.
I think you should be able to try your clicker. That might work now too.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Mr. Neal asked that I start out with just providing a little background about myself and my firm so you can understand what kind of work we do. And then I want to spend most of the time talking about the FAA's Next Gen program, and I'll explain in a moment what that's about, and talk a little bit about the status of flight tracks, particularly at MSP, and finally, rather briefly, talk about what the next steps may be as we begin to explore this issue. My firm of Kaplan, Kirsch & Rockwell is a law firm based in Denver and Washington, D.C. We have a national practice that focuses on transportation, land use, and environmental work. We think we are the nation's largest practice dedicated to airport law, which sounds like an esoteric field, and in fact it is an esoteric field, and most of our 18 lawyers spend at least part of their time in the area of airport law. Our representation is primarily of local governments and airport agencies, both airports and communities around airports, some private sector clients, but in the airport realm, most of our work is on behalf of public agencies. This map just provides an illustration of the states where we have been working in recent years, and in particular, the cities that are shown here are cities where we've worked on flight track issues in particular. Again, sometimes on behalf of communities, sometimes on behalf of airport proprietors themselves. My practice is focused primarily on airport-related issues and has been for the last 25 years. I do both counseling and litigation, and unlike some lawyers, I both work with the FAA and against the FAA. And frankly, although some lawyers like to take one side or the other, we believe that knowing both sides helps our clients in either respect in terms of understanding what FAA is thinking about and what communities are thinking about. I personally split my time between Washington and Denver when I'm not in cities more or less all over the country. As Mr. Neal said, we've done prior work in the Twin Cities area and represented Minneapolis, Eden Prairie, and St. Paul over the course of the last 25 years or so. So let's delve into NextGen. I'm going to try to avoid the use of jargon and lingo. If I slip into that, raise your hand or scream or something. It's a disability of lots of lawyers to use lingo, and in the aviation business, it's particularly hard not to. So I'll try to limit myself to NextGen, which is the term the FAA uses to apply to its system for modernizing the nation's national airspace system. Very simply, what it does is brings the national aviation system out of the 1950s into the latter half of the 20th century. NextGen was supposed to be fully implemented by 1990, and that slipped a little bit to 1992 or 94, 98, 2000, 2010, and now it is 2025. The technology behind NextGen is today very routine. In the 1980s, it was thought of as cutting edge. The basic principle is this. Today, most aircraft, the navigation of most aircraft, is handled by radar. NextGen is based upon GPS, or the kinds of systems you have in your car, in your phone, foretelling navigation based upon satellites and other data. The difference between NextGen and the current system is that aircraft today have to have radar contact with ground stations occasionally over the course of their route. What happens then is aircraft follow, and you'll see this on maps of aircraft routes, they follow various trajectories from one point to the next, not necessarily in a straight line, based upon where the waypoints are located. NextGen is much simpler. In essence, and I'm way oversimplifying this, but aircraft are given a particular geographic coordinate, and they fly directly to that geographic coordinate, and the avionics, the equipment in the aircraft, keeps the aircraft on track. There are a couple things that happen as a result of NextGen. Number one is there will be new routes for aircraft to fly. There will be new procedures for how aircraft fly, and there needs to be new equipment both on the ground, at the airports, and in the aircraft, avionics it's called in the aircraft, in order to take advantage of this technology. And it basically exploits what was once cutting-edge navigation technology and is today pretty much routine because it's the same thing you have in your car. It's based upon satellites as opposed to radar. Now, there are a couple of advantages of next-gen technology. Most importantly, that the tracks that aircraft use are much more precise. That is, rather than the radar going from point to point, the aircraft itself is kept on track on a particular precise direction heading toward its ultimate destination. So it improves the efficiency of the aviation system. It increases the capacity of airspace so that you can get more aircraft in the air without interacting with each other. Interacting with each other, by the way, is a term we like to use instead of crashes. And it lowers the cost to airlines. And so it is, to some extent, a motherhood and apple pie kind of technology. The problem is that it is astoundingly complicated and expensive to implement. When you think of the number of aircraft in the United States and around the world, the number of airports, the amount of equipment that has to be implemented, it's a huge undertaking. And that's the reason why it has slipped 30-something years in its implementation. It is today the FAA's highest priority, and it will be until 2025. They're spending about $1 billion a year on implementation. And that's just the FAA. That's not the pilots, the aircraft owners who have to equip their aircraft, have to train their pilots, and so on. So this is just from the air traffic control perspective. The FAA is putting enormous effort into this. The next point is an important one, which is the agency. The FAA's expertise is growing and evolving. This is not next-gen technology, and the implementation of next-gen is not something we know much about. And the FAA is learning as it goes along. Now, in certain respects, that's wonderful, and other respects, that's miserable. For example, technical issues that arise are being studied in real time. As next-gen technologies are implemented, new technical issues are addressed and resolved. There are many unanswered questions. And among those unanswered questions are, what are the environmental impacts? Or more specifically, what are the noise impacts of the changes in aircraft procedures and flight tracks as a result of that technology? And the FAA position on this is rather inconsistent. So let's look for just a moment at where NextGen is. And this map, which may be a little hard for the audience to see, the blue circles show airports that have NextGen technology implemented. The bigger the circle, the more routes in and out of that airport have been implemented. So you'll see Minneapolis in red is a relatively small circle. There are larger circles like Denver, Memphis, Atlanta, Cincinnati, where many more procedures have already been implemented. Ultimately, the whole country, of course, will have next-gen implementation, but it's a process. Think of it in many respects analogous, if you will, to the freeway system. Suppose tomorrow the government decided we are going to abandon all the interstate highways in the United States and we're going to build new ones. Well, building 2 miles of interstate highway won't get you very far. Building 50 miles may get you from Minneapolis to the next city.
Mr. Kirsch,
yes.
Interrupt you for a moment. Member Bennett has a question for you.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Kirsch, as long as we have this map in front of us, can you please point out those airports that are similar to the Minneapolis airport in that they are surrounded by residential neighborhoods rather than Denver's airport, for instance, which is located well outside town?
Let me give you a non-answer to that question, if I may, with your indulgence. Every airport is different. Minneapolis tends to have more residential close into the airport, but it also has more residential a couple miles away from the airport. So let me give you an example of Denver, for example, which has very little population anywhere near the airport. And as a result, changes in flight tracks that affect the first couple miles around Denver really do not affect very many people. You take Atlanta, which has a lot of industrial property immediately adjacent to the airport, but a mile or two away from the airport has the kind of population density that Minneapolis does. And so each airport is different, and that's part of the problem. We have to be very careful not to say just because the FAA did something in one airport, they should do the same thing here. It has to be very geographic specific. Minneapolis has some advantages, particularly to the south. The river provides some advantages. To the north and to the west, it does not have advantages of having areas that are not heavily populated.
And again, with your knowledge base compared and contrasted with mine, can you point to anything on this map, any city or airport on this map, that is more similar to Minneapolis, where the implementation has been full, 360 degrees, most flights?
The simple answer to that is no, because no airport has been fully implemented with NextGen yet. Airports are in various stages. Minneapolis is about in the middle, I would say, in terms of implementation. What's interesting is that the level of public controversy has varied considerably as these procedures have been implemented. And I think we probably even see this in Minneapolis, where the level of controversy to the south and west is significantly less than the north and west. And so even within each airport, the level of controversy has varied depending on the particular tracks. But I would say if I were to compare one airport more than anything else, it probably would be Atlanta, which is a little bit ahead of Minneapolis in terms of the implementation of RNAV. And I'm sorry, I did it, of next-gen technologies.
Yeah. Our residents know the term RNAV.
Well, I'll try. I'll still try not to do it. It's a bad habit. So, and I will explain what RNAV is later.
Sure.
So I'm sorry, Councilmember, if that's non-responsive, but I really don't want to say you're just like another airport.
Sure, and following up on that answer, then, so Atlanta might be the closest to Minneapolis. Again, the industrial property closest to the airport with residential neighborhoods beginning about a mile out.
That's right.
What has been the pattern of implementation, the fullness of implementation, and what mitigations, if any, have been provided for those neighborhoods that began a mile from the airport?
That's a good question, and the short answer is the FAA has done very, very little mitigation. And I'm going to get in a moment to the fundamental problem we have, but let me jump to that and I'll come back to it in more detail in a moment. And that is that the way the FAA measures noise is very precisely rigid. And by that I mean the FAA has a methodology for measuring noise and a threshold for where it considers noise to be significant. Given that methodology and that threshold, almost no airport will have any noise impact from next-gen technology. Let me say that again. Almost no airport will have any impacts from next-gen technology. Now, that's the FAA's position. We're going to delve down a little bit more beyond that because in many respects the FAA position is an artifact of their arbitrary decision as to what constitutes a noise impact in terms of level of noise and what metric to use. And that's part of the problem we have here, is that if I were to ask the FAA whether they anticipate any noise impact from next-gen technologies in Edina, their answer would be quick, which would be no. There will be no noise impact. And again, as we delve down a little more, we'll see why that's not necessarily true in terms of how the public perceives things, in terms of how, if you will, real human beings perceive things.
Let me ask you a question while you still get this map up, as well as a follow-up to Member Bennett's question. Are there any airport locations in the United States where there has been a partial implementation of NextGen, where the FAA or the local airport authority has convinced the FAA to modify any procedures that they normally follow in terms of takeoff pattern, the so-called track patterns based on population density? It's kind of an awkward question.
I understand the question. I don't think I know the answer. Certainly before NextGen, the answer is absolutely all over the country. But with respect to NextGen, remember, we're only about a year or two, maybe 3 at most, into this process. And to the extent that airports had influence over the FAA, we might not necessarily know that. We know about MAC. MAC was very public about their interactions with the FAA, which frankly has been enormously helpful. But I am aware of 1 or 2 airports where I have worked where there have been quiet approaches between the airport and the FAA that, for obvious reasons, I'm not comfortable talking about in public. But I'm not aware of any other airports that have weighed in and said, stop for a moment on your next-gen implementation until we look at this more deeply. Okay. And I think, again, that's partly a phenomenon of the fact that we're so new in the implementation that understanding of what the impacts are is still really quite new.
All right.
So let me. I mean, I've said previously I don't want to use lots of abbreviations, and I won't, but I think we can delve down really quickly into abbreviations, and let's be careful about that, because whether we talk about RNAV or RNP or OPD and so on, we can talk about all these, but the fundamental issue is getting away from the technicalities, is that what the FAA is proposing is a new set of technologies for controlling aircraft, which can, don't have to, but can change the flight tracks, can change the altitude at which aircraft fly. And
I need to interrupt you one more
Yes.
time, because another question came to my mind based on the prior slide, and that is, are there any other locations around the country where the FAA has indicated they would abide by the decision of the local airport authority? Because in November, at least it was the inference was left with Edina and I think other communities potentially affected by RNAV, that what the MAC wanted to do or recommend in terms of the next-gen system would be what the FAA would adopt. Is there any other airport authority around the country where the FAA has taken that position?
Well, yes, but no, and here's the reason. The FAA guards jealously its authority. It will never say that it is doing what MAC asked it to do. As a practical matter, however, the FAA does respect greatly the individual airport sponsors. And so the FAA may say, thank you very much for your input, MAC. We're going to do what we want to do. Remarkably, it's exactly what you asked us to do.
Okay, good. And, well, remind me, as we proceed here, I've got notes from a conversation that some of us had with the local FAA official where he said they were going to follow the recommendation of the MAC.
And they may be more candid here than they are in most places. They certainly want to know what MAC requests. They certainly want to know what the other players request. I'm going to get into that in a moment. But the FAA will guard jealously its own authority, particularly if there's disagreement. If MAC asks for something and their technical people say something different.
Yeah. Well, having said that, I will tell you that it was not the local FAA official who made the presentation at the MAC hearing. It was a fellow from Washington, D.C. that I believe you know. And
yeah, Dennis Roberts is a very smart guy and one of the best in the industry, one of the best at the FAA. And I think Dennis was being more candid than perhaps his colleagues normally are about the relationship that the FAA wants to maintain with the airport. So all that being said is that while the FAA will be and is the decision maker, having MAC play a major role in that can be enormously important.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me just...
One quick follow-up on
Yes,
the map
Member
as well. So in terms of the total number of airports, where are we? What percentage of airports have been converted to next gen of the total?
No airports have been completely converted. And the FAA is about halfway through the top 35 airports in the country. So, and they've got another, what do we got? Another 12 years to finish this. So they're moving forward. They are not doing this on an airport by airport basis. That is, they're not implementing all procedures at Minneapolis and then going to the next. They're doing a couple at each airport and then moving on to the next, because in part the efficiency or the value of RNAV is not just the arrival and departure, but the en route, so that it's more efficient to be able to have an RNAV or a next-gen procedure from Minneapolis to Chicago than just have Minneapolis. And so what they're doing is looking at city pairs in particular to make sure that the next-gen procedures are available for the top markets from Minneapolis, for example, or the top markets from New York LaGuardia. And that's really where they're focusing, is where there's the most traffic first, the busiest routes.
Okay.
All right, so a busy route would be Atlanta. Are they the busiest airport in the
Yes.
country?
Yes.
All
Yes.
right, so Manager Neal and I met with one of our residents who's a pilot, commercial pilot, who flies international, flies for Delta. And he told us and showed us maps that out of Atlanta, they use the RNAV next-gen system, but they run the flights out of Atlanta, which you said was the airport most comparable to Minneapolis-St. Paul. They run flights out of there on a 12-track system. Is that true to your knowledge?
I don't
You
know. As a factual matter, that makes sense.
All right.
Atlanta is very, very complicated airport. I mean, not only is it quite a bit bigger than Minneapolis, it has more runways, and the complexity of the airspace there is to my feeble mind, mind-boggling.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Let me just sort of illustrate, if you will, if I can, the complexity. This map, which nobody can read and understand, shows MSP inside that black circle. And these are all the current arrival and departure routes to MSP. So we're not just talking about one route here, one route there. We've got different runway ends from different directions. And NextGen is going to reduce but not eliminate this complexity. So when we talk about how difficult it is for the FAA to convert to NextGen, this is one airport. Minneapolis happens to be one of the larger airports in the country, but this is one airport, and imagine doing this times several hundred around the country. Now, there are both benefits and costs of NextGen in terms of implementation, and I want to focus on three in particular because I think they're the ones that we need to focus on for the purposes of Edina. First is change in flight paths. Second is the concentration of flight paths. And the third is change in aircraft altitudes. The first one, as I mentioned earlier, under NextGen, aircraft can fly more direct and a straighter approach and departure. That is, they don't have to follow, if you will, sort of a zigzag across the sky. Again, that can be good and that can be bad depending on what's underneath them. The second is that because of the way the radar system works, most flight tracks are fairly wide, anywhere up to a half-mile wide, meaning that noise is spread over a half-mile wide swath. Again, good or bad depending on how you look at that. With NextGen, the aircraft can be much more concentrated. And if that is a track, if underneath that is all industrial property, that's very good. If that's not all industrial property, what it has is the effect of taking a little bit of noise over a half-mile wide swath and making a very concentrated noise over a much narrower swath.
I know the question Member Bennett wants to ask, and it's a good one.
Well, we have had this question has been raised. It's been raised in public meetings with the Noise Oversight Committee and with the MAC. How wide are we talking? Because people so far have not been able to get an answer
We
to that.
don't know.
Even where it's implemented?
We can go back and look. Now that we have some data, we can go back and look at individual airports and see how wide it is. And we don't know what it's going to be at this airport because it's a function of actually how aircraft fly the procedures. Now, what we can do, and I don't know that the FAA has done this on a national scale, is look in general, what does it look like? But there's now enough data available from some of these airports that I think we can collect data. I haven't seen it yet, but we can collect data on what the current width or the width of the paths will be with the next-gen technology.
Where can we or city staff access that information? Because, again, that's something of great concern that has not been...
Let me give that some thought. I know that both Denver, Atlanta, both have very good flight track recording systems, and so they're likely to have very good data. I've got to think about other airports. Dallas-Fort Worth, I think, has good data, and the data will mostly be collected by the individual airport, and it's a matter of getting it from them. I don't think that's going to be terribly difficult, but it's a good question, and I think it's going to be important for us to have a better sense when we say that the tracks are going to be narrower. Does narrower mean 1,000 feet, or does it mean 100 feet? I just don't know as a technical matter what it's going to be here yet. The third piece, which is important to understand as well, is the altitude of the aircraft may change under next-gen technology. Again, to grossly oversimplify the current technology, the pre-next gen, aircraft land and take off in most instances in sort of a stair step. They go up a little bit, they go flat, almost flat for a while, go up a little bit. Each time an aircraft changes its altitude, there's an increase in noise. A deceleration of the engine or acceleration of the engine. Under next-gen technology, the FAA is testing and has found very successful a continuous departure, continuous ascent or descent procedure, which avoids those peaks in noise, if you will. And so it will avoid the hot spots of noise. On the other hand, it may mean that aircraft are at different altitudes than they used to be, even if they're over the same track. And so one of the things that we need to examine is not just where are the tracks going to be, but what is the difference in altitude of the aircraft at that same location today as opposed to in the future.
Member Swenson.
So what I heard was the assumption that if they didn't stair step, that there wouldn't be huge changes in noise, but I didn't hear you say if they kept at a more even slant in or up, that there would be less noise.
Yes, there's likely to be less noise at the locations where they previously used to stair step.
Okay.
But the problem is they may be lower
right
at that location, which could increase noise. That's why it's much more complicated than just saying this is quieter than this.
Thank you.
It can be true, it cannot be true, depending on the unique characteristics. So,
has there been another question on
yes.
that same altitude issue? In Europe, in some locations, Schiphol, I think at least one of the London airports, Heathrow, and you may know Zurich, I believe, they all use or the European governments require that the airlines use a close-in departure technique, which means they basically climb out on a steeper angle once they get to 400 feet. So is there anybody in any airport in the United States where the FAA is requiring or has agreed to close-in departure technique usage by all airlines?
Yes. There's only one as far as I know, and that's Orange County, John Wayne Airport in Orange County, California.
And what's the experience there in terms of noise abatement or the effect on noise when there's a closer-in departure technique utilized?
It's been very, very successful at Orange County Because, again, let's go back to the point on this slide. The geography there is such that the area right around the airport is not noise sensitive, because a very steep ascent produces a great deal of noise there. At Orange County, they have a small buffer of commercial and industrial property and then a lot of residential. And so concentrating the noise very close to the airport is a very good idea in Orange County. That may not work here necessarily. And that's been in place in Orange County for 20-something years now.
All right. So here you could see Richfield suffer from something like that. Is that?
And that's part of the problem. And the point I want to make on this slide goes exactly to that, which is that there is no national answer. And we have to be very careful about saying, well, a faster departure, that's great. Well, maybe not. Maybe it's not good here. It's a function of the geography. It's a function of the local land uses. It's a function of the unique characteristics of the relationship of the airport to its neighbors. It's also a function of community expectations. To pick on perhaps Atlanta a bit, College Park, Georgia, gets an enormous amount of noise. It's gotten an enormous amount of noise as long as planes have been flying. And College Park is always angry. Everyone else in Atlanta is very happy about College Park because they take the burden for everyone else. That's the way it works in Atlanta. Now, should that work that way here? That becomes the kind of trade-off that the community working with the airport and the FAA have to decide. And there isn't a good answer in most communities. The question of community expectations is very important. It sort of goes back in part to what I said about College Park. They have come to expect levels of noise such that changes in flight tracks or small changes in altitude don't bother them, if you will, as much as if there was a community that previously had no noise and suddenly is exposed to a great deal. Also, next gen does not necessarily mean new flight tracks. It may, and where there are new flight tracks over areas that were not previously exposed to noise, clearly the issue is more significant than if it's an existing flight track and you're making, if you will, minor tweaks. The final point has to do with relative change in noise. And this is an issue that the FAA is not particularly sensitive to, and that is to again oversimplify. If you are in a neighborhood that has traditionally had very little noise, and you get a level of noise that's below what the FAA considers to be significant, but it's a huge increase for you, that's a bigger deal for that community than if you're already highly exposed to noise and you get the same increase in noise. So what we see is, for example, and people make this comparison all the time, you look at communities outside airports in Florida where people routinely keep their windows open year-round, where the ambient noise level is very low. What's acceptable noise in Florida is very different than it is in Queens, New York, where people, just by the nature of the community, have already a higher ambient level. So we need to look in terms of understanding the community reaction, not just at the absolute level of noise, but what's the relative change in noise as a result of the next-gen technologies. Now, I'd like to go from sort of the generic specifically to MSP and talk a little bit about what we know about the flight track problem here. We've already, of course, talked about the fact that the FAA is developing these next-gen routes for MSP, that departure routes would be consolidated, and the two of these, as far as we know, would be over Edina. And that the greatest impacts, again, as far as we know from existing data, is from the new departure routes from runway 30R and 30L, meaning that to the north and northwest are areas that are more likely to be seriously affected, using all the criteria I just talked about, than areas to the south and southwest. At MAC's request, the FAA has delayed implementation of the procedures. As far as we know, this is the first time the FAA has ever done that.
That's what we've heard too.
And I don't want to minimize the importance of that. That's important because MAC has very good relations with the FAA. It's also important because MAC was willing to go to the mat. Very, very few airports will be willing to do that. And so we need to recognize MAC has done something that most airports wouldn't do already. And that's important to know in terms, as we look forward to strategy, understanding that MAC has been not just cooperative, but in an affirmative way, far more helpful than a lot of airports would be or have been in this instance. MSP may well be the test of NextGen for a number of reasons. Number one, I already said NextGen has not been fully implemented anywhere, and so the issues of what the impacts are to some extent still a little abstract in a lot of communities. Secondly, the environmental review requirements, that is, how much does the FAA have to tell you beforehand, are very unclear and have recently changed to your disadvantage.
Member Bennett.
Back to that first point, and you have said several times very clearly that it's not been fully implemented anywhere, and that was also stated very clearly at the hearing before the MAC last November. However, there has been a contradiction at public meetings of that statement, and in fact, members of the public have been told that it has been fully implemented in locations around the country, and that the FAA representative who said that it hadn't been fully implemented was speaking in error. And I'm not questioning your veracity at all, but on behalf of the residents who've been given this conflicting information in fully public forums, I'm confused as to why something that relatively straightforward could be said in contradictory ways.
Well, let me, I hope I'm right, first of all. I'm not trying to dissemble, so if I'm wrong, I'll be the first to admit it. And in fact, it may have changed in the last couple of months because it's being implemented day by day, and maybe by now somebody's been fully implemented. But I think the reason that there may be ambiguity is, what does it mean to fully implement? Mm-hmm. The FAA is tweaking these things on a very regular basis. So they may, in fact, have adopted RNAV procedures for all the runway ends at a particular airport. I'm not aware of it, but it's possible. But they may not have finished the tweaking. And that may be the difference. I mean, people may be sort of splitting hairs here. But if it has been implemented fully at any airport, I'm not aware of it, and it's not likely to be one of the big airports.
Thank you.
I want to focus on the last point on this slide, which I alluded to a moment ago, which is
you had mentioned earlier that the environmental review requirements have changed, and they have not changed to our advantage.
They have not changed.
So if you want to further explain that, it would be helpful.
I talked a moment ago, and I will talk in a little more detail in a minute about the FAA's views of noise. But Congress, in an effort to expedite the implementation of NextGen, has allowed the FAA to avoid any environmental review under federal law for any NextGen procedures where the effect of the procedure is overall to reduce noise. Not clear what that means, overall reduce noise. Does that mean reduce noise everywhere? Does that mean reduce noise on the average? Does that mean some increase and some decrease, but by and large it's less? The FAA is wrestling with that right now. They received a recommendation from an advisory task force a couple of weeks ago that said, in essence, let's look at the entire impact on the entire route, and if the total impact using FAA criteria is less than it was today, you don't have to do any environmental review. Needless to say, that's going to come under some scrutiny. The FAA, again, and I'll get to this in a moment, uses criteria for what constitutes noise impact that are at odds with what I think the normal community believes are the correct thresholds. And I'll get to that in a moment. But I think that the trend today is in favor of doing less and less environmental review. For example, the FAA was proposing to do no environmental review at Minneapolis before implementing all of these procedures. They did the lowest level of environmental review and environmental assessment at Denver, and had the most minimal amount of public participation and public information. They did slightly more at Seattle. They did perfunctory is a little generous. They did perfunctory review at Las Vegas. So the amount of environmental review the FAA is doing, it varies from 0 to slightly more than 0. Minneapolis is at the 0 end, and probably I would say Seattle is closer to the 1 from 0 to 1, but nowhere near an environmental impact statement, nowhere near the level of scrutiny that, for example, MAC would face if MAC were trying to do something like this.
Thank you.
Question on the
Swanson.
definition of environmental review. Is that normally the majority of it noise related as environmental?
Yes. Emissions are an issue in some areas,
Because
particularly.
we get letters about emissions, so, often environmental review are the windmills killing or the eagles, but when you're
No,
talking...
in this instance, it's mostly noise, and to a secondary degree, in some airports, it's also air emissions.
Okay, thank you.
Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these charts because I think everybody has looked at these in detail over the last couple year plus. But it's
Excuse
just
me, I want to ask
yeah.
you another question. Back up to the environmental review. It's, if I recall correctly, the MAC recently completed its 2040 work, and in the context of that work, I believe that an environmental assessment was done, and the FAA has approved that 2040, I'll call it an expansion plan, and including the environmental assessment that was encompassed within that 2040 plan. Do you have any knowledge of that?
I know about it, but I haven't read it. And if your next question is, does it assume next gen? I don't know. I'd have to read it.
Okay.
But I know that process has recently been completed.
And since the FAA has approved that, it strikes me that that's one more thing that be a bit concerned about from an environmental review standpoint.
If that assumed next gen procedures, but I just don't know the answer to that. And that clearly would be one of the first things we want to see is what's the current data that's available. I want to delve a little bit here into the noise consequences because I think it's important to understand why, to some extent, the dialogue is ships passing in the night. Will there be a noticeable noise impact of next-gen technologies around MSP? The FAA says no. We're done. There will be no noticeable noise impact. The community says, yes, there will be. And MAC, to their credit, says, you guys resolve this. MAC is trying to be helpful here, I believe, because MAC doesn't want to tell the FAA that they're wrong. They don't want to tell the community they're wrong, but they're trying to play, if you will, something of a middleman role. So why the different views of noise impacts? How can the community say there are going to be impacts and the FAA says they're not going to be? Number one, the FAA uses a standardized metric and a national threshold for noise that is not sensitive to next-gen impacts. The metric they use is a metric called DNL, average day-night noise level. The threshold they use is 65 decibels. They use that for almost all purposes at all times. When you look at the kinds of impacts that are going to be experienced from the next-gen technologies, at least at the cities I've looked at, all of the impacts that are most significant are at levels where the noise is less than 65 decibels DNL. Furthermore, the DNL metric, which and I'm not going to get into the technical complexity of how it's measured, does not adequately account for the number of operations. So that if you previously had 5 overflights at X level, and today you're going to have 25 overflights at slightly less noise level, is that more or less annoying? That's an important issue to ask about. The DNL metric is not sensitive enough to address that question. There are other metrics. MAC uses a lot of these. One metric called time above. How many minutes or how many seconds a day is the noise above a certain level? That's a very useful metric to tell you not how much noise, but how often do you have noise. Okay? Another metric is SEL. What's the maximum noise level you get on a routine basis? There are other metrics other than the FAA's metric that may be more useful, but even more importantly, there are other thresholds less than 65 decibels that will be more useful. One of the reasons that the FAA says there will be no impact is that none of Edina is located within the area exposed to 65 decibels DNL. Therefore, you have no noise today. You have no noise tomorrow. We're finished.
Yeah, Member Bennett.
Well, first backing up just slightly, exposed to 65 DNL or 65 decibels measured by that logarithm. It isn't that it doesn't happen, it just isn't measured by.
That's right.
That's okay.
That's correct.
When was that standard adopted, and what has been the pressure, what was the pressure that got it into place, and what, if any, pressures have been brought to bear to try to change it to something, for instance, like Australia uses, that measures more real-time, real life?
You didn't intend to ask that question to sort of bring out the noise geek in me, but here goes. It was adopted as a result of a statute in 1979 where Congress directed the FAA to adopt a single threshold and a single metric for the purposes of land use compatibility planning. That is, for the purpose of planning land use around an airport. The FAA has since then, by regulation, applied that standard to environmental review, to noise restrictions, to funding of noise mitigation, essentially to everything the FAA does. They have applied the metric that Congress directed them to develop for all purposes. That has been subject to enormous criticism for at least 20 years. That criticism of the FAA has gone almost on deaf ears, in that the FAA now allows airports, if they want, to look at noise using other metrics and other thresholds, as the FAA says, for information purposes only. The FAA will not make a decision based on that, and they will not, in most cases, allow airports to make decisions based on that. So there's been a little bit of erosion, but only a little bit. I will tell you that MAC is at the forefront of that erosion, in that MAC has been one of the most aggressive airports in the country to say we need to use a different metric in addition to DNL, and we need to use a threshold other than 65. There are other airports that have done that as well, and they have been very successful in being much more nuanced about understanding what the noise impacts are.
So there have been local efforts. What about any effort in Congress to change that direction, again, to be more recognizing of the actual impacts?
There's been no effort. No effort in Congress at all. And, yeah, I mean, we can talk a little bit, if you want, about why that is and why the FAA has been able to maintain that. The threshold that was established as a result of the 1979 statute was established not just based upon what are people's reactions to noise, using a study referred to as the Schultz curve, which is a study that examined how much people are annoyed by noise. It was based not just on annoyance, but also on economic considerations. And that is, how much could the FAA afford to address when it came to noise? And in 1979, there were literally millions of people around the country who lived in areas exposed to noise greater than 65 DNL. Today, there are probably a couple 100,000. And so the FAA, in part, developed that to say, as a matter of prudent economics, we can't afford to address noise any less than this level. Now, that metric and that threshold has taken on a life of its own way beyond that original intent.
So in other words, noise isn't what we perceive, it's what the FAA said it could afford to mitigate.
That's correct.
Thanks.
That was the original derivation, and that's certainly still true today. So I want to talk a little bit, and we've addressed this a bit in the answers to questions here, but the players and their roles, because it's really important as we begin to move forward to look at these. Now, this puzzle has a missing piece, and it's intentionally missing because the other three players are far more important: FAA, Delta Airlines, and MAC. And I'm speaking here specifically about MSP. The largest carrier at a hub airport is very important. And I'm not, in this session, going to talk much about Delta Airlines, but Delta Airlines is quite important to the FAA. It's quite important to MAC. It's quite important nationally. Everyone other than MAC, Delta, and the FAA have a relatively small role in looking at implementation of next-gen technologies. So let's look at the FAA in particular and the weighing that the FAA has to do. They are looking on one side at safety, efficiency, time, fuel, and airspace capacity. And on the other side, community impacts. Now, this is admittedly a biased scale I've put up here. But what I'm trying to illustrate is that the FAA has a number of considerations on the other side that have nothing to do with community impacts. Given what I've previously said about how the FAA examines noise, it is for them relatively straightforward to do this balancing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the sense we have, is that in their quest for safety and efficiency relative to NextGen, and their quest to argue, at least environmentally, that there's a fuel savings, that those factors far outweigh any community impact.
Well, I think in part...
Or if community impact is a de minimis consideration.
Well, that's right. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. There are no community impacts because, remember, there's no noise here.
Yeah.
And therefore, when this balancing comes in, it's pretty easy. Look at all these things on the left-hand side, safety, efficiency, time, and nothing on the other side. Great. This is a very simple process. And that is how the FAA has been approaching it. Let me go to the next slide, though, because it's really important to look at MAC. MAC has a much tougher job than the FAA because MAC has to look at all these various parties, and MAC has to live in the real world. So we, of course, have the airlines. We have Delta. We have the air traffic control tower, and they are sensitive to make sure the air traffic control tower has adequate staffing. They've got the other cities around MAC, the cities to the northwest, the cities to the southwest. MAC staff itself has views. The FAA, NOC, plays a significant role. General aviation, that is everyone who does not run commercial airlines. The MAC is in a much more difficult posture because they have to weigh all of these various players and, in a sense, has to bring them together because the FAA is saying to MAC, what do you want? You are the representative of this airport. And that's why when MAC wrote the letter they did to Dennis Roberts of the FAA saying, hold off to the northwest, it was really quite unusual because MAC said, we have done this. We've looked at all these various players, and we've said we are not yet able to recommend next-gen technologies to the northwest. And that's a very important tool for Edina to use to its advantage. And I will say that, again, as I mentioned earlier, maybe the only airport so far that's done that. So what's Edina's challenge in particular? And I call this to some extent bucking the trend, because NextGen's here to stay. To argue that NextGen should not be implemented is a little bit like arguing against the horseless carriage. The new technology has lots of advantages, including advantages for Edina and other communities. The new routes, as the former head of the air traffic organization said in a blog a couple months ago, are 1/3 art, 2/3 science. Keep that in mind. 1/3 art, 2/3 science. That means that there's not just one way to design these routes. And the art part is us, is the community, are all the people who are affected, who don't have, if you will, sort of the technical issues to argue. There's enormous economic and political pressure to implement NextGen quickly. The FAA is 30 years late. Congress has been hounding them for why they're so late. We're about 20 years behind the rest of the world. So anything that delays NextGen is something the FAA is going to fight hard.
For 20 years behind the rest of the world, what can we learn from the rest of the world in terms of noise abatement with respect to NextGen technology?
There's a lot of good work that's been done in Europe. And I have to admit I haven't looked through all of that. Schiphol and Heathrow, in particular, a little bit less in Germany, have done some very good work on analyzing how to reduce noise as a result of the next gen technologies. And I apologize, I have not looked at all those.
Member Swenson.
Does Europe measure DNL at 65 decibels? Do they use the same kind of measurement for noise?
No.
Okay.
No, they are far more
nuanced,
tailored, exactly. So the question I want to bypass this slide. I want to stick it up here, but I want to bypass it because ultimately the question for Edina is which path should it pursue? Once it has the information it wants, does it say we're not that concerned? It's not that big a deal for us. Does Edina say, no way, no how, we're going to fight to the end of the earth to stop this, whatever this is? Or is there some middle ground here? And I want to put this up, but I want you to ignore this for a moment because it's a little premature to make that decision until we get to the next couple steps. The next step is we need to get more data, technical, legal, political, and regulatory. And Council and Mr. Mayor have raised a lot of, I think, really, really useful questions here tonight, and I apologize I can't answer all of them, but they are questions that need to be answered before, at least my advice would be, before the Council is able to say, going back to this chart, which path is best. What will the impacts be? How serious are they? What kind of trade-offs are we going to talk about? Is this a zero-sum game, so whatever you save is something that your neighbors are going to have? Don't know the answer to those, but those are all questions we need to examine at a level and using metrics and methodology that have meaning to the public before that question can be answered. So let me conclude here by walking through some next steps, and I'm going to walk gingerly through these steps because as the city manager said at the beginning of the presentation, I don't want to talk about strategy in public, particularly if the city council decides to pursue a particularly aggressive strategy, then there may be litigation and so on. But I want to give you, if you will, a roadmap of the process I would recommend rather than the substance of exactly what you should do. So the first step, as I alluded to a moment ago, is let's figure out what the probable impacts are. And let's not do that using formalistic standards that say we will assume no noise at X level. Let's look what the impacts are and let's examine what they mean in Edina. Not in another city, but in Edina. Number two, let's
when you say determine probable impacts, Mr. Kirsch, what's the assumption? That we're going to look at probable impacts based on a two-track system?
Well, I think we start with that.
Multi-track system?
I think we
close-in
start
departure technique?
We start with what has been put on the table.
All right.
So that we know, in essence, if we folded up shop and said, we're okay with this, what does that mean to this community?
Okay.
Because the next step will be, of course, if the answer to that is the probable impacts are not acceptable, then we'll want to look at what the alternatives are. So once we have some good data, the next step is to consult with MAC, with the NOC, so that we can see, do we have allies in this? Are there other participants who accept our analysis of the kinds of impacts? Step three, and I put this in red for an important reason, to develop a comprehensive confidential strategy. It's important that the city council know where you're going and how you're going there. And with no disrespect intended to the public, that strategy has to be confidential because it should involve a number of different tools, from litigation to negotiations to political strategies, to compromises, and to put that all on the table at the get-go will really essentially defeat your ability to succeed. Fourth step is, once you have that strategy, to propose a process for a solution. This is not just with MAC, but it may be with the FAA, and it certainly is with your neighboring communities. Step five is to present a proposal to the FAA of specifically what you recommend. Your recommendation may be your proposal FAA from 2012 is exactly what we want, we're perfectly happy, or it may be something different. But you're not presenting that proposal until two things. Number one, you've done enough analysis to know what is good and bad about what they've proposed, and presumably are in a position to say, here's something better. And you understand what you're going to do if the FAA tells you yes, or they tell you to take a hike. Number six, there's a collaboration process. Is this going to be one phone call where they hang up on you, or is there going to be a series of meetings? I have no idea. I think past practice, particularly in the Twin Cities, suggests that they will not hang up on you. In some cities, I think the FAA would. So I list this because given the history of MAC and MAC's relations with the FAA, I think a collaboration with the FAA has some chance of success. Next to the last is to participate in an environmental review. Now, this presumes that as part of our proposal to the FAA, we've demanded some level of environmental review. The reason should be pretty obvious is that some level of review, it seems to me, is at least necessary so the public understands what the consequences are. And step 8 is to pursue what I'm sort of putting in quotes as other options as necessary, and I don't want to go at this point, of course, into what those other options may be, but you can probably be creative and think about what they may be. I've probably spoken more here. This presentation is taking a little longer than I wanted, but I'm happy to answer other questions as you wish.
Member Sprague.
I just have a question, simple question for you in terms of leverage, because I'm trying to understand where our leverage is. Federal preemption's against us, the Congress and the business lobby, and the momentum of this thing is against us. So where will our leverage be? I heard you say possibly in the relationships between MAC and the FAA, but I'm not understanding the mind of FAA and where we would have leverage in this situation.
That's a hard question to answer now for two reasons. First of all, if I knew the answer, I'm not sure I'd want to answer that in this forum. Secondly, I don't know the answer yet. That's part of what these several steps are, is trying to figure out, if you will. I mean, what my job as a lawyer is to figure out what's your strongest argument and what's the other side's weak underbelly. I've got some ideas, just given previous work I've done here and previous work I've done on flight tracks. But I'd prefer not to go into that if I don't have to right now.
It's a technical argument, or is it a grassroots effort, or is it a combination?
Yes.
Thanks.
I don't mean to be flippant here. It's just that it's all about leverage. And if I tell you now what the point of leverage is, I've sort of blown it. Because I've told the other side not to say necessarily, I'm not arrogant enough to think that MAC is listening to this tape, but if they may happen to be listening to this tape, I don't want them to go home and say, we know exactly what they're going to do, and now we know what we can do, so that they aren't a pain in the neck.
I'm just more curious about past players in this game and what has proven effective in a broad way.
That's a good question.
Grassroots versus a technical campaign or a legalistic.
Let me give you some examples of that, and I think that question I can answer. It is very much a function of the relationship, two relationships. One is the relationship between the airport and the community. In some communities, grassroots is useless. It is far from useless in this community, given MAC's relationships. Number two is the relationship between the airport and the FAA. And again, MAC has a different kind of relationship. Well, it almost goes without saying every airport has a different relationship with the FAA. MAC has been willing to tell the FAA, in this particular instance, that the views of the community are really important. And the letter from, was it late last year, I guess November of last year, from MAC to the FAA, read that carefully. Because it indicates, it sets forth standards that MAC expects the FAA to follow going forward, which are very community-centric. And that's quite unusual. And MAC would not have written that letter if they didn't think the FAA was going to be responsive. So I think we see here the relationship between MAC and the FAA is something we need to exploit to our advantage.
I'm personally encouraged by a couple of things. One was the fact that on relatively short notice, with an active campaign from our citizenry and our council, the MAC was our ally in only doing a partial implementation of NextGen on runway 17. And then I'm also encouraged by what I heard you say. I assume it's the head of the FAA who said that these NextGen technologies implemented at our airports around the country are going to be 2/3 science-based, 1/3 art-based. It seems to me like if this is going to indeed be an airport location where it may become a model for the rest of the country, we've got a chance to participate in the design of a system that not only deals with safety and efficiency, but deals with the needs of people that are underneath these flight paths. And that when they look through the lens in determining what to do, that they don't just look through the lens of safety and the lens of efficiency and the lens of fuel savings, that they look through the lens of humanity as well.
I think that's right. I think that being a trailblazer can be both positive and negative. In this instance, I think it's likely to be positive, and let me explain why. Of course, lawyers don't like unprecedented things, and the FAA doesn't like unprecedented things. But in this instance, the FAA has a more difficult time saying, sorry, Edina, we don't do that, because in the last 35 cities we haven't done that, because we're early in the process. And so what we set as the standards, or as the demands of the community here, the FAA has a harder time saying that's just not how we do things. Now, the other side is we can't point to 35 communities behind us who've already done that. The communities in the Twin Cities have not been shy about being trailblazers when it comes to airport noise issues. And the FAA knows that. Mm-hmm. And I think that works to our advantage.
What was the gentleman's name from the FAA in Washington you referred to?
Dennis Roberts, I believe.
Dennis Roberts.
Made the presentation.
I hearken back to something he said, and hopefully we have a chance to address it with him again, and that is he said, well, this next gen is just the creation of the interstate highway system for the skies. And of course, I think what we all remember is that when the interstate highway system was created back in the mid to late 50s, early 60s, yeah, it's a system that spanned our country and made us reach the pinnacle of being able to move people and goods in an effective and efficient way. But every major metropolitan area they came to, they had to customize it.
Yes.
They had to customize it based on what was going on in that particular locale. So I'm thinking those same arguments would apply here, that with respect to our metropolitan area, and Edina in particular, there's a requirement for customization to meet the needs of every metropolitan area.
I think that's right.
Member Bennett had a question too, or a comment.
I defer to Member Swenson if she has more questions about Next Gen, because I actually have questions about another topic related.
No, I asked mine as we went along.
Okay. Mr. Kirsch, it occurs to me that, yes, the community did make itself very clearly heard. It also was a fairly broad coalition. The mayor mentioned earlier close in impact affecting the city of Richfield. It also affects the city of Minneapolis. At the same time, we have neighborhoods in Minneapolis that are about as far from the airport as neighborhoods in Edina, and they will experience effects as we will, depending on what is implemented. And so I do believe that part of the result last fall was that broader coalition, and that broader coalition has brought other concerns to us as well. There certainly is a lot of concern about what may be coming, how it will be designed, and how it will be implemented. There are, however, concerns about what's going on right now. And in neighborhoods in Minneapolis and in neighborhoods in Edina, people are perceiving more flights, flying lower. We know that the load factors are up, that there are, according to records, fewer airplanes with larger number of people flying on them, again, heavier load factors. And my question is, what can be done about those current conditions? Because there are people in these neighborhoods, in the community, that are finding even current conditions intolerable.
I'll probably be shot next time I go to the FAA for saying this, but my experience is that when a community says something has changed, it's because something has changed. And the FAA is very resistant to that principle. If they say, we haven't changed anything because how we measure noise, how we direct aircraft is the following, they don't like accepting the fact that things have changed. The good news here is that we have pretty good data, at least close into the airport, from noise monitoring systems and other systems that MAC has in place, so we can probably find out what's changed. If it's changed over Edina, it's probably changed closer in as well. And so analysis of that data will be important to determine what's been the change. Why has there been a change? Why are people perceiving a change? And until we know that, it's hard to figure out exactly what path to follow. For example, maybe it's just that the aircraft are flying lower because of lots of cloud cover, for example. Or maybe it's because, as you say, higher load factors, the aircraft are slightly lower. I can make up a bunch of stories. I don't know if any of them are true. But getting the data will help us understand whether the perceived change today is because of some change in operations.
And that process is underway right now. That'll be forthcoming in the month of July. We have partnered with a coalition of neighborhoods in Minneapolis called MSP Fair Skies. We've also partnered with the Minneapolis City Council member whose ward sits immediately adjacent to the airport, and made there was a tender, an offer of information coming out of a meeting that was held with a resident who lives under a particularly busy flight path, and that has been expanded to include more information. One of the co-founders of MSP Fair Skies met yesterday with staff at the MAC, and refined that request still further. It is, I believe, going to include, now it's going to get beyond my technical abilities, but some raw data as well as some assembled data.
Good.
And again, we're looking at July being able to see that. One of the things that has been identified as a possible cause, probable cause of the change, increase in noise, is the underuse of a runway that was designed and has flights that are departing, crossing the paths of flights that are incoming, and so it becomes a time issue, not an impossibility issue, not a safety issue, and that might be something that we would want to look at again in coalition to ask to be changed. What is the track record of communities on having changes made in current operations when in fact those operations are producing changes that are oppressive?
The track record is pretty good, not spectacular, but it's based on the following. Number one, is there data to support what the community is asking for? Has there in fact been a change? Number two, and perhaps most importantly, is the solution one that is practical? The FAA is enormously sensitive to what they call controller workload. So if the solution is one that is technically feasible, but would significantly increase the workload of the air traffic controllers, it is therefore probably not a practical solution. So the track record is good when the community has done their homework and first identified the problem and secondly identified a solution that is practical. Now, this may be a situation where neither of those is the case, but certainly we've worked in many instances where we go to the FAA and say, if you were just to make this change, suddenly the community reaction would be enormously reduced. The FAA has been really quite responsive to that. And particularly, obviously, if MAC is on your side with that.
Thank you.
I wanted to craft a question in conjunction with that 65 DNL number. So based on, during the hearing, I'll back up and talk about it this way. During the hearing in November, one of the representations made by Mr. Roberts was that they were only partway through with the environmental work, but it strikes me from what you said tonight that may have been a disingenuous response because they don't think they need to do any environmental work in Edina because we're beyond 65 DNL.
I don't like accusing people of being disingenuous. Let me try to be generous here. He may have been partly through the environmental work necessary to determine that he didn't have to do any environmental review.
Yeah, fair.
But, I mean, there's a threshold,
yeah. And
I mentioned before the congressional threshold is there overall a decrease or an increase in noise as a result of the proposed procedures? And so what he may have meant is we're doing our analysis to make sure there's an overall decrease, and therefore we don't have to do any environmental review. Yeah. I'm trying to be generous, and I think that may be what he means.
That's a fair interpretation of what.
But we do know that the agency is strongly disinclined to do environmental review on next-gen procedures. And we also know that Congress has recently endorsed that. And that's been causing some problems for airports because they're the ones, if you will, on the ground who are having to respond to community concerns, and the airport says, I don't know what the impacts are. The FAA hasn't done any analysis. And so there's been a little bit of pushback by airports, and certainly some of my airport clients have been encouraging the FAA to do a non-environmental review. In other words, okay, you don't have to do it by the book, you don't have to do it by the formal process, but at least let's look at some data so the public can understand what's going on.
When you talk about changing current conditions, as Member Bennett was talking about, is that information always looked at on a scientific basis relative to the data that you were talking about that might be available, or is there some benefit given to anecdotal information that's submitted? For example, the MAC has a website you can go to where you can register a noise complaint. You know, should we be making sure that our residents register a noise complaint so that one argument could be removed from the from the FAA in the future of them saying, well, we changed patterns over there and you didn't say anything about it, so what's the problem?
Noise complaints are very scientific in certain respects. That is, if somebody calls to complain, there's a problem in that location. The number of times that a person complains is less scientific. And we certainly see in a number of airports, and I don't know if this is true around MSP, that a vast majority of the complaints are submitted by only a couple of people. And so it's not the number of complaints that each person submits, it's where they're coming from that's important. And if the complaints are clustered in a particular neighborhood, that suggests, again, scientifically, that there's a problem in that neighborhood. And so, yes, it is of some value. It is not as much value as noise data, but it certainly is of value.
Okay, thank you. Member Swenson.
One thing I think that our residents need to know about noise complaints, there are two ways to do it. You can go on the MAC to their noise complaint area and do it. And once you've done it and put in your address, you'll be surprised the next time you complain, it pops up, oh, hi, 6021 Kaiser.
Nice to see you again.
But the other thing is that you can call, and if you call, I know Member Bennett has told me before, they will take more information. So there isn't a comment area when you do, you just complain there's noise. But, where I wanted to say, well, look, all of a sudden I've got planes coming every 2 minutes and, I can't hear the Today Show. I couldn't say that on the computer one, but if I called, I could tell them that.
I think that's a good point.
There is an advantage, actually, to calling because you can give them more specific complaint information.
And MAC has a pretty sophisticated system for collecting that data.
Yes.
And so submitting complaints is of value, particularly when we want to look at clusters of where complaints are coming from.
Good. Member Bennett.
It's at macnoise.com.
Thank you.
macnoise.com, and the telephone number is on that
It's there,
website
yeah.
also.
Thank you.
So it seems like our council's got to make some decisions here about your recommended next steps. And then Manager Neal, in what context can we do that, and how quickly can we move on making a decision?
How quickly can you
Well,
move?
we need to decide as a council, with some public input, I think, whether we want to move to to the steps that are being proposed by council, because it's our intention, I think, to continue to retain Aviation Council here for a variety of reasons that we may not want to discuss in public that our residents would well understand.
I think your custom on an issue like this has been to take time to learn about it, which you certainly have, and receive some expert testimony or a presentation on it, which you have tonight, and to give some consideration to it, but typically take it up at your next council meeting and plot not plot a decision, but make a decision about a direction that night.
So let me ask...
Because that allows for some time for some public discussion, dissemination of what's been heard tonight, and for you to have the benefit of that.
All right. So, Mr. Kirsch, I don't know, this may put you in an awkward position, but when the legislative session was over, we did receive a contact from the MAC saying, now that the legislative session is over and we've dealt with the issues we needed to deal with there, we can now turn our attention to Next Gen and RNAV, and we want to start working with Edina and the FAA on this issue. So my question to you would be, what role would you think that you should appropriately play at the outset of those discussions, if any?
I guess my advice would be, I think you should accept that invitation, but that is, you should accept the invitation, but I think you have a little bit of homework to do before accepting it. And that being that you need to figure out, and this is sort of what I was alluding to a moment ago, you need to figure out what you don't know and what you need to know. Now, MAC may have a lot of that information, or you may have to go get it yourself. But before you sit down at the table with MAC, you need to be in a position to know what information is important for you to be able to engage in a conversation. And my hope is the MAC will be helpful in that. I think they will be. And if they have the data already, terrific. If they don't, maybe they'll help you collect it. But to be in a position where you can convey to MAC that you're going to be making a fact-based decision as to what the city council position is going to be, and that you need good facts that the public will trust are as good facts, so that when you ultimately sit down with MAC and say, how about if we do this or this track or that track, it's based upon the best available data. My experience with MAC is they will be responsive to that. Not every airport would be. But I think at least that would be my recommendation as to how to accept the invitation. Now, at the same time, it seems to me, behind the scenes, you want to be thinking about what happens if these conversations with MAC are not successful, either because MAC says we won't help you, or because MAC says we'll help you, but the FAA won't. And so you need to have your plan B, C, and D ready, or at least in process, as you begin this conversation with MAC.
I think we all concur in that. Okay. Any other questions?
But time is of the essence, because part of our leverage is we're early stage. So the faster we can collect the data, analyze the data, and use that to create a position, the better off we're going to be overall.
I think that's a really important point, and I apologize for not having made it in the presentation. Time is on your side, but we don't know how long it's going to be on your side. That may be months, it may be a year or two, but it's not very long.
So in the context of that statement, we've asked through the coalition to gather this data. What's the timing on the response from MAC?
There is a Noise Oversight Committee meeting on July 17th. I understand that the data will be presented at that meeting. That will be 1:30 in the afternoon at the MAC offices on 28th Street, south of Crosstown 62, open to the public. And there will be, I think, a release of the data to the requesting entities before that meeting is held.
We have a council meeting on the 16th.
Right.
Can we have this on our agenda?
We can. And we are expecting, and we have reserved time on that agenda for a presentation from Jeff Hamill.
Right.
I think if I can just add one point that I think is important, and I alluded to a bit in my non-answer to Councilmember Sprague. I think you need to communicate to MAC that you don't intend, if you will, to negotiate in public. I'm hopeful that MAC will be respectful of that and will frankly appreciate that. You need to keep the public informed, but as one of my earlier slides indicated, there are a lot of parties here of various levels of informality. The only formal party is the FAA, but there's MAC, there's Delta Airlines, there are other users of the airport, and the other side of the table. I'm not exactly sure where these people are on the table. Are they all on the other side or some on your side? But let's assume for a moment they're all on the other side. They will not appreciate having to negotiate with you under the glare of TV lights. And I think the likelihood that you have frank conversations will be substantially decreased if they believe that every back and forth with you is public. Now, I know that's not a good thing to say to an elected official, but as a lawyer, my advice to you is that you need to have meaningful conversations so that you know whether this is possible. And meaningful conversations have to be done at a level of confidence and confidentiality that allow you to have them.
So with that comment, are you suggesting that we're part of this coalition? Are you suggesting that we have a two-track approach where we have doing some work with the coalition, but then of course we have to look out for our own specific interests as well and follow a strategy that follows that line as well? So we almost have to feed in two different worlds. You know, we're with a broad coalition of other cities, but when it comes down to the nitty-gritty details of implementation, our interests may differ from the coalition's.
Without getting too deep into confidences, yes. I think that's absolutely right.
Member Swenson.
I think what you've told us is that this isn't just simply a litigation solution or a political solution or a grassroots residential solution. That is all of the above, and is what I heard from you. So we're going to have a lot of tools that we need to put into the toolbox, and your position would be that, having someone like you on board is one of the tools.
Well, I'll reserve judgment on that last point, but as to all of the others, I absolutely agree. I mean, you need to, it would be a mistake to assume that one path or one tool is enough.
Yes.
My experience in working on these issues everywhere is you've never had just one path when you're successful.
Well, for someone who just likes a bigger hammer, I'm going to have a different toolbox for this solution then, because my solution usually is just a bigger hammer.
Well, Councilmember, you can be the one with the big hammer, and I suspect somebody else may want to have the soft hammer, if you will.
Okay.
What do you think the position of Delta Airlines will be relative to this implementation of RNAV?
Delta is a very complex entity, and understanding Delta's needs and position is very difficult. They are, as a firm, they're very aggressive, and they are very protective of their interests. I'm not sure I want to say much more than that.
All right, that's fine. I can read between the lines as well as anybody else in this room. Does a close-in departure technique require the use of additional fuel? Let me ask it a different way. Would Delta have a distinct interest in not engaging in a close-in departure technique out of Minneapolis-St. Paul due to the fuel consumption issues involved?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. Anybody else? Mr. Kirsch, thank you for coming up to meet with us. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure.
And it was very helpful to our community, and we're pleased that we had a special meeting and were able to get this on film.
Well,
so
thank you. Thank you for
people in
the
our community
opportunity.
can access your comments.
If this were Congress, I'd be allowed to edit my comments before they get on TV, but I guess I can't do that.
Bummer, that doesn't happen.
Put a little bit of,
That's right.
makeup on, but I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we've got a couple other pieces of business to do this evening. One is a request for purchase 2013-2014 city insurance contracts. It looks like you finished some negotiating there, or have received some bids.
Thank you, Your Honor. Yes, we have. We have our current. We have a proposal from our current carrier, Travelers Insurance, and we have another proposal from the League of Minnesota Cities Insurance Trust. We've had an opportunity to work with our two agents and also with other staff to evaluate those respective proposals. And at this time, I would recommend that we continue our current relationship with the Travelers, and that we re-up that coverage for an additional year. And we've detailed the proposed bids, and also a little bit about the various coverages that are within those two proposals.
All right, Member Bennett.
And then, Manager Neal, are you recommending that we make a switch in a year, or that we reconsider again the question of making a switch in a year?
I strongly recommend that we consider taking another look at this next year. There are advantages to the city from being with a group of cities in an insurance pool like the LMCIT. This particular year, it's hard to justify making that kind of change when the premium is higher and the deductibles are also higher. If there were a different combination of factors there, it might make this decision more difficult, or this recommendation more difficult. This year it is not.
Do we have a unanimity of opinion from our insurance representatives on this issue? All right. Thank you. Do we have a motion?
So moved.
Second?
I'll second.
And then discussion?
Okay, thank you, Mayor. So, Manager Neal, I read the memo and understand there are qualitative and quantitative differences between the two policies, and I just wanted to clarify one sentence. We talked a little bit of this by email, but in the first bullet point, it says the league's coverage includes items that Travelers doesn't cover. Examples include, and it goes down the list and says, and legal assistance with other situations that could result in future litigation. Can you expound on that?
Yeah, is that reference to land use? Karen, is that the land use litigation primarily?
I think that can actually apply in a broader sense, but typically Travelers won't cover you unless a suit has actually been filed, whereas the league will step in earlier and provide you with legal assistance, even if there's a potential for a suit down the road. And that could be land use, it could be an employment situation.
And then the other point for next year is if we can, on the quantitative side, if we can quantify any projected savings, that would help us to look at the overall package based on our past claims.
Yes.
Thanks.
So, Karen, what you're saying is that if someone would assert a claim but not file a suit, we may get representation from the league.
Right.
But
They might come in when there is a claim asserted or threatened, whereas Travelers is more reluctant to do that and really will wait until something has actually been filed.
And staff is also recommending staying with Travelers this year?
Yes.
In addition to our insurance representatives?
Right.
All right. Got a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. Carried. Last matter on the agenda this evening is we added to the agenda was the potential motion to endorse Tim O'Brien of Edina for appointment as our area representative to the Metropolitan Airports Commission, and Member Bennett has this matter.
Yes, thank you, Your Honor. I believe that Manager Neal has a resolution for us to consider. The seat has been previously held by a St. Louis Park resident. I think that it encompasses a geographic region that is twice as large as a Met Council district, stretching up into, I believe, New Hope and Crystal, as far west as Hopkins, St. Louis Park, Edina, Bloomington, Richfield, part of the southwest area of the city of Minneapolis. Very large area with interests that are, again, part of the greater community's interests, but also have some unique properties. And the appointment expired in January. All appointments were being held pending legislative redistricting of the Met Council seats. That was accomplished during the session, near the end of the session, and so there has been, again, a hold on those appointments pending the completion of that process, and the governor will now be filling those seats. I believe that Mr. O'Brien is a very knowledgeable and bright and responsible and comprehensively knowledgeable member of our community, and would represent us and adjacent communities quite well.
We know Mr. O'Brien in many ways. We
I
had
have
him go through board and commission application process with us. And
yes, and I've known him personally since 1992, and know his work not only in this community, but also on a regional and state level.
Yep, I would support that resolution.
All right. We got a motion from Member Bennett and a second from Member Swenson. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed say nay. Carried. Well, we'll hope the governor will abide by our advice here. Thank you.
And we will communicate. We'll put a letter together tomorrow and communicate this to the governor's office and also to our other state legislative elected leaders so they can know what your recommendation is.
And Mr. O'Brien is here. Oh.
Yep. Mr. O'Brien, any comment you
Along
want
with one of our state.
to make?
Just thank you for the opportunity to serve, and we'll see if the governor is appointment.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Any other business for the council this evening? All right. We will stand adjourned and see some of you at the 4th of July parade.